Angelica Guerra-Baron. She's from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Pontificia University in Bogota. She's from Colombia. And she brings some really interesting experience in addition to publishing in academic settings in Latin America. She was also a negotiator for trade deals for the Colombian government. And so this will be really interesting.
Today I was preparing a presentation where I could talk kind of an introduction to this great topic, but I think you both made a great introduction, so I just go straight to the point. I'm actually writing a paper about this topic, so when I knew about this presentation, I thought, well, brilliant. So I have to thank as well the GIGA, is the German Institute of Global Areas, because we're having a sponsorship about the investigation of Brazil like a huge global player, mainly a regional global player. That way, I'll talk about the Brazilian and the Colombian experiences from the debt crisis of the 80s as an extension of transnational policies or networks of policies. I think you have done a good introduction about these topics, and I would say that Colombia and Brazil did adopt very similar development models. Three elements I would stress. First one, industrialization and economic growth. The model of inward-looking development easily was the right tool which they chose by the moment, and all this is explained by the role of Raúl Prebisch, the creator of the Latin American structuralism. In that way, I argue that, I have a main statement, I argue that the role of transnational policy networks during the Latin American external debt crisis was cornerstone. From the South American country's perspective, the model of inward-looking development was present in virtually every country in the region, as I already said. From the Colombian perspective, the integration process was conceived as a way to avoid negative effects potentially derived from the prohibition policy and as an opportunity to strengthen relations under a South-South scheme. The Andean country considered an exception during the external debt crisis, as we did not went into default, took advantage of its membership to the Andean Pact in order to mitigate the risk of the debt crisis. As for the southern corner, Brazil and Argentina too, did experience external debt accumulation, which led to financial crisis. The Brazilian military governments, which ruled the country since 1964 till 1985, tried to take advantage of new opportunities derived from the world economy through international capital loans aimed to develop its industrial sector, which at the same time encouraged external credit markets to loan to state-owned enterprises, which is government debt. Fully aware of its economic growth from 1982 to 1984, the Brazilians deteriorated relations with the International Monetary Fund and experienced a transition from a successful and well-behaved country to being the challenger of the entire debt regime in terms of Cardoso and Fischler. The Brazilian authorities had to do different things, such renegotiate its debt with the private banking sector. They had to reestablish relations with the IMF due to the differences that there were between the policymakers and the institution. And they had to adopt the Washington Consensus measures in order to make part of the initial round of brandy bond issuance. And I would say this is the part when the Brazilians had to take the step from just trying to have a different position before the International Monetary Fund and then had a position where they had no choice. They had to adopt neoliberal ideas in order to obtain potential loans. In my paper, the main statement is that despite the fact that most South American governments did declare in default during the 80s crisis, the Colombian government decided to carry on with the Andean community process to overcome such a situation, while Brazil, under dictatorial regimes and away from any economic bloc, was initially reluctant to align with the IMF recommendations, but pushed, as I already said, by transnational policy networks and the international scheme, the Brazilian decision makers adopted neoliberal policies to enjoy the benefits derived from the American initiative. In order to develop such argument, I follow Nell and Stephen's definition of what is foreign economic policy. And in that sense, I focus my research on three main topics. The first one is the country's relation with the International Monetary Fund, I mean Colombia and Brazil. In the second place, the government approach towards regional integration process. And thirdly, the government attitude towards the attraction of FDI flows. For obvious reasons, the time, which is an enemy all the time, I only will tackle the part of the relation of those countries with the International Monetary Fund. In that sense, I'd rather go to the preliminary conclusion so that the time can be enough to further discussions. As a preliminary conclusion of the variable I want to work on, I would say that during the 70s and 80s, many Latin American countries implemented measures to liberalize its financial sector and relax or eliminate foreign exchange regulations as a requirement to obtain loans from international financial institutions. In that sense, almost all Latin American governments had to ask for IMF stabilization programs. In the 80s, despite the 70s attack to the fund policy, mainly due to the negative effects derived from it as a punishment to deficit countries and the consequential reduction of state sovereignty. So that was an element which Colombian and Brazilian governments took in mind. I accept IMF recommendations. I accept the fact that I have to apply neoliberal policies. That where is the place, or where shall we put sovereignty? Some Latin American countries, such as Brazil, did prefer private credits and stabilization programs domestically designed. As a response to such generalized state conduct, the IMF lowered the conditionality of its programs. However, the fund institutional power changed as the 80s debt crisis emerged in 1982, which at the same time made the fund to adjust its approach to Latin American developing countries. In the Colombian case, there is something really, really shocking, because the foreign Colombian policy is not an answer to a policy of state. When we talk about the Colombian foreign policy, we should remember that there is not a real plan to see the future of the country. It just responds to the situation. It responds to the thoughts and to the immediate needs of the main decision. I mean, the person who has to take the decisions, the president. In that case, it's really interesting to compare both foreign economic policies. The Brazilian was quite influenced by the military experience since 1964 till 1985. On the contrary, Colombia adopted three different reasonings before the IMF issue. The first one was when a President Betancourt, wanted to have wide relationship with its people with domestic issues. In that case, President Betancourt decided just to open up its mind and try to get to a common approach with its people and with the sub-regional groups, such leading a group just to get to an answer to International Monetary Fund with a sub-regional focus, I mean. Another president, the Colombian president who received the country at the beginning of the 80s, adopted just a policy of alienation with the US. Therefore, we can say Colombia was a very well-behaved children. Colombia did not have any problem at all with the International Monetary Fund because of that kind of alienation with the US foreign policy. And thirdly, we had another president who did follow that path, just alienation. So it was really, really difficult kind to see how a country can approach to an international financial institution when the president and the elite who is with him or with her only wants to follow US interest and international financial institution goals. Taking that in mind and following with the preliminary conclusions variable, I would say that the 80s, the crisis, meant for Brazil and Colombia the first step to adopt neoliberal measures in its territories. Why do I say that? Because, as you wonderfully said, IFE scheme was the one which were used by most Latin American countries, both Brazil and Colombia. But since the 80s crisis, both countries adopted openness. Both countries decided to be used like a channel to apply all ideas of liberalization properly of the 90s. Despite historical realities and different effects derived from the 80s crisis, Brazil and Colombia had to accommodate to the world new patterns imposed by the IFE. The global policy regime was obligatory, taken into account by domestic government agendas, not only because of those countries' memberships to the Bretton Woods institutions, but due to the fact that its neighbors were adopting such strategies too. After the 80s crisis, its imbalances and results, developing countries have been calling for governance, for changes, for having a voice in different kinds of international organizations, mainly WTO, which is not under discussion here, but it's important to remember, and institutions such IMF and World Bank. The Colombian case is quite unique due to its foreign policy alignment with the US, the institutions it represents, and its pragmatic, short-sighted, and presidential reasoning. I mean the Colombian strategy to tackle international issues. Where neoliberalism became the worldwide language, I would say that's the main answer of transnational policy networks. International financial agencies imposed structural adjustment programs in many debtor countries. That's why if you study Brazil and you compare it to the Colombian case, you find that after the 90s, all neoliberal ideas were implemented and were adopted. Who are the losers of it? I would say the people, because Colombia and Brazil report the Gini index with more serious results. Thank you.